The Arab billionaire arrogantly insulted the waitress in Arabic, smugly offering, "Translate this, and my entire salary is yours." But his face went pale when she fluently replied, "Tell us your city below, then enjoy the story and subscribe for more. Trust me, the ending will leave you speechless." The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Meridian, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, casting golden light across the pristine white tablecloths. Heather Martinez wiped down a corner table, her movements efficient and practiced after 3 years working here. At 26, she'd learned to blend into the background, to be invisible to the wealthy clientele who frequented this establishment. It was safer that way. "Table 12 needs water," Carlos, the head waiter, called out as he rushed past with a tray of champagne flutes. Heather nodded, grabbing a crystal pitcher from the service station. Table 12 sat near the window overlooking Fifth Avenue, currently occupied by a man she'd been trying not to stare at since he'd arrived 20 minutes ago. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her annual rent. His dark hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that came with generational wealth. She'd overheard the hostess whisper to another server that he was Khalid Al-Rahman, a 34-year-old billionaire from Dubai who owned half the luxury hotels in the Middle East. "Finally," Khalid said in English, not looking up from his phone as Heather approached. His accent was crisp, educated, tinged with British inflection. "I've been waiting." "My apologies, sir," Heather said quietly, filling his glass. She'd learned long ago not to engage more than necessary with demanding customers. Khalid's companion, an older man in an equally expensive suit, leaned forward. "You should be more careful, Khalid. Americans are sensitive about service complaints. Americans need to learn what real service means," Khalid replied, still in English, finally glancing up at Heather. His eyes were dark, assessing, dismissive. He switched to Arabic, his tone casual. "Look at this one. Probably can't even spell her own name correctly. These people have no education, no class. They smile and pretend to care about your meal while dreaming of their pathetic tips." His companion chuckled, responding in Arabic. "You're terrible." "I'm honest," Khalid continued in Arabic, gesturing vaguely at Heather as if she were part of the furniture. "I bet she hasn't read a book in her entire life. These American waitresses are all the same. Pretty faces, empty heads, no ambition beyond their next paycheck. I could insult her family right now, and she'd just smile and ask if I wanted dessert." Heather kept her expression neutral, her hand steady as she finished pouring the water. Inside, something cold and sharp twisted in her chest. She'd heard variations of this speech before, in different languages, from different wealthy men who assumed their money made them superior. Usually she let it slide. She needed this job. She had rent to pay, bills to cover, a future to save for. But something about Khalid's particular brand of arrogance ignited a spark she usually kept carefully dampened. Khalid leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing at his lips. He met Heather's eyes directly, speaking in rapid Arabic. "Here's a challenge for you, Habibti. Translate what I just said, every word, and I'll give you my entire monthly salary, $50 million, cash. But you can't, can you? Because you're just another pretty, empty-headed American who—" "You said," Heather interrupted in flawless Arabic, her voice calm and clear, "that I probably can't spell my own name, that I have no education or class, that I smile while dreaming of pathetic tips, that I haven't read a book in my life, that American waitresses are pretty faces with empty heads and no ambition beyond their next paycheck, that you could insult my family and I'd just smile and ask if you wanted dessert." The color drained from Khalid's face. His companion's mouth fell open. Heather switched back to English, her professional smile never wavering. "You also just offered me $50 million to translate your insults, Mr. Al-Rahman. I'll skip the money, but I would like to clarify something. I have a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from Columbia University, where I graduated summa cum laude. I speak 5 languages fluently: English, Spanish, Arabic, French, and Farsi. I work here because I'm saving money to fund my doctoral research on contemporary Arab-American cultural exchange, which is difficult to do when people like you assume service workers are beneath basic respect. The silence that followed was deafening. Khalid stared at her as if she'd materialized from thin air. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. I also, Heather continued, her tone still perfectly pleasant, have read over 300 books in Arabic literature alone, including works by Naguib Mahfouz, Tayyib Salih, and Hanan al-Sheikh. Would you like to discuss al-Sheikh's feminist critique of patriarchal Arab society? Or would you prefer to order your entree first? Khalid's companion let out a strangled sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. He muttered something in Arabic about karma, then suddenly remembered an urgent phone call and excused himself, practically fleeing to the restaurant's entrance. Khalid remained frozen, his dark eyes locked on Heather's face. She could see him processing, recalculating, his arrogance crumbling into something that looked almost like shock. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "You!" He started, then stopped. Tried again. "You speak Arabic." "I believe we've established that, yes," Heather said. She pulled out her order pad with practiced ease. "Now the chef recommends the sea base this evening, prepared with a lemon herb reduction. Or if you prefer something more familiar, we have an excellent lamb tagine, though I should warn you it's not quite as authentic as what you'd find in Dubai." A flush crept up Khalid's neck, staining his cheeks. For a man who'd entered the restaurant like he owned it, he suddenly looked remarkably uncomfortable. I apologize. That was inexcusable." "Your apology is noted," Heather said, her tone neutral. "Would you like a few more minutes to decide, or shall I come back?" "Wait." Khalid held up a hand, his composure slowly returning, though the smugness had vanished entirely. "Please sit. I'm working, Mr. Al-Rahman." "Working, mister." "I'm asking you to sit," he said, and there was something different in his voice now. Not commanding, but almost pleading. "Please, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation, though I have none that would justify what I said. But at least let me try to make this right." Heather glanced around the restaurant. Carlos was watching from across the room, his eyebrows raised in question. She had 4 other tables to manage, and the dinner rush was about to begin. Every practical bone in her body told her to walk away, to let this arrogant billionaire sit in his discomfort while she went back to work. But something in Khalid's expression stopped her. He looked genuinely shaken, stripped of the casual cruelty he'd worn like armor. She had no idea what was about to happen, but her instincts whispered that this moment would change everything. "You have 2 minutes," she said, not sitting, "and then I have other tables to attend to." Khalid nodded, seeming to accept that he'd earned nothing more. He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its perfect styling, and when he spoke his voice was quieter, more honest than anything she'd heard from him yet. "My name is Khalid Al-Rahman. I'm 34 years old. I inherited a hotel empire when I was 25, after my father died. Since then, I've built it into something 3 times its original size. I employ 40,000 people across 6 continents. I speak 7 languages. I have 3 master's degrees from Oxford. And despite all of that education and experience, I just proved myself to be exactly the kind of ignorant, privileged fool that my father spent his entire life warning me not to become." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't forgive me. But I want you to know that you just taught me something nobody else has managed to teach me in years, that my assumptions make me blind, and my privilege makes me cruel, and neither of those things is acceptable regardless of how much money I have or where I come from." Heather studied him, trying to reconcile this humbled man with the arrogant one who'd mocked her minutes ago. That's a nice speech, Mr. Al-Rahman. Very polished. But words are easy. Anyone can apologize when they're caught. You're right, Khalid said immediately. So tell me what would make it more than words. Tell me how I can prove I mean it. You can't, Heather said simply. Not in 2 minutes, not in 2 hours. Proving you mean something takes time and consistent action. And I don't have time to wait around and see if a billionaire decides to become a better person. She clicked her pen, all business again. Now, would you like the sea bass or the lamb tagine? Or would you prefer I send Carlos over to take your order? For a long moment, Khalid said nothing. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. A real smile. Nothing smug or calculating about it. It transformed his face entirely, softening the harsh lines of his jaw, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He looked younger, more human, and dangerously attractive in a way that made Heather's stomach do an unexpected flip. The lamb tagine, he said, and I'd like you to tell me if it lives up to the real thing. You've been to Dubai. Twice, Heather said, wondering why she was still standing here talking to him. Once for a research conference, once for a summer intensive studying Arabic dialects. Then you know that no restaurant outside the Middle East can properly make tagine, Khalid said. The spices are never quite right. The lamb is never quite as tender. But I order it anyway, everywhere I go, because I like to see how different cultures interpret it. Does that make me hopeless or hopeful? That depends on whether you insult the chef afterward, Heather replied. But there was the faintest hint of amusement in her voice now. Khalid caught it, his smile widening. Touché, I deserved that. He paused, then added quietly in Arabic, I truly am sorry. What I said was unforgivable. Yes, it was, Heather replied in the same language. Then, in English, I'll put in your order. The tagine takes about 30 minutes. She turned to leave, but Khalid's voice stopped her once more. Heather! She glanced back, surprised he'd remembered her name from her name tag. Yes, thank you, he said, for not letting me get away with being terrible. Heather didn't respond. She simply nodded and walked away, her heart beating faster than it should, her mind racing with questions she didn't want to answer. She just put one of the world's richest men in his place, and instead of getting her fired, he'd thanked her for it. She had no idea what that meant, but little did she know, this was only the beginning. And before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your city in the comments below, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe for more. Now let's see what happens next. Over the next hour, Heather tried to focus on her other tables, but she kept finding her gaze drawn back to Khalid. He sat alone at table 12, his companion never returning from that convenient phone call. He ate slowly, methodically, his attention shifting between his phone and the window overlooking Fifth Avenue. Twice she caught him watching her as she moved through the restaurant, and both times he looked away quickly, like a child caught doing something he shouldn't. When she brought his check, he handed her a black credit card without looking at the total. Keep the change, he said quietly. Heather glanced at the bill. His meal had cost $340. When she processed the card, her eyes widened at the tip line, $20,000. She returned to his table immediately. Mr. Al-Rahman, there's been a mistake. The tip amount, no mistake, Khalid interrupted, standing and buttoning his suit jacket. He was tall, she realized, at least 6'2", and standing this close, she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle, cedar and amber. You were right earlier. Words are cheap. Actions matter. Consider it a down payment on proving I'm not completely irredeemable. I can't accept this, Heather said, though her hands trembled slightly, holding the receipt. $20,000 would cover 3 months of rent and living expenses. It would give her breathing room she hadn't had in years. Then donate it to a charity that supports education for underprivileged women, Khalid said. Or keep it and use it to fund your doctoral research. Either way, it's already processed. I won't take it back." Before she could respond, he walked past her toward the exit, leaving behind the faint scent of cedar and a confusion that sat heavy in her chest. She stood there, frozen, until Carlos appeared at her elbow. "Did that man just tip you $20,000? Her manager whispered, staring at the receipt in her hands. "I think he did," Heather murmured. "What did you do? Perform a miracle?" "I spoke Arabic," she said, which was both the truth and nowhere near the full story. 3 days later, Heather had almost convinced herself that the encounter with Khalid al-Rahman had been an anomaly, a strange blip in her otherwise predictable routine. She'd deposited the check after a long internal debate, and tried not to think about the man who'd given it to her or the way his smile had transformed his entire face. Then he walked into Meridian again. It was a Tuesday evening, typically slower than the weekend rush. Heather was refilling water glasses when she heard the hostess's excited whisper, "Mr. Al-Rahman, welcome back. Right this way, sir." Her heart did something complicated and unwelcome in her chest. She kept her head down, focusing on her task, but she could feel the moment Khalid's eyes found her across the restaurant. The air seemed to shift, charged with an awareness she didn't want to acknowledge. The hostess seated him at table 12 again. Of course. Carlos intercepted Heather before she could escape to the kitchen. "Table 12 is asking for you specifically." "Tell him I'm busy," Heather said. "He's a VIP, and he just promised to recommend our restaurant to every hotel chain he owns," Carlos replied, not unkindly. "Go take care of him, Heather. Whatever you did last time, do it again." Heather took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and approached table 12 with her professional mask firmly in place. Khalid stood as she arrived, an old-fashioned gesture that surprised her. "Ms. Martinez," he said formally, "thank you for attending to my table." "Mr. Al-Rahman," she replied, equally formal, "may I start you with something to drink?" "Actually, I'd like to apologize," Khalid said, not sitting back down, "for the tip. I realize now it might have made you uncomfortable, and that wasn't my intention. I was trying to—" He paused, seeming genuinely uncertain, which looked foreign on his confident features. "I was trying to show you that I meant what I said, but I think I may have just made things more awkward." Heather relaxed slightly. There was something disarming about his uncertainty, about seeing this powerful man fumble for the right words like anyone else. "It was generous," she said carefully. "Unexpected but generous, thank you." "Did you keep it or donate it?" Khalid asked. "That's personal," Heather replied. "You're right, I'm sorry." He sat down, and Heather noticed he looked tired, faint shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've thought about our conversation constantly for 3 days. It's been educational." Despite herself, Heather's curiosity won. "Educational how?" Khalid gestured to the seat across from him. "Would you sit, just for a moment? I promise I'm not trying to get you in trouble with your manager. I already spoke to him about it." "You spoke to Carlos?" "No. I may have mentioned that I'm considering hosting a private event here next month for about 200 of my business associates," Khalid said. "He seemed amenable to you taking a short break." Heather should have been annoyed by his manipulation, but instead she found herself fighting a smile. She glanced around. The restaurant was quiet, her other tables content, and made a decision that probably wasn't smart. She sat. "5 minutes," she said. "I'll take it." Khalid leaned forward, his dark eyes intent on her face. "I want to hire you." That was not what she'd expected. "Excuse me?" "As a cultural consultant," Khalid continued quickly, "I have meetings scheduled in New York over the next 6 weeks with various American business partners. Most of them will involve dinners, events, social situations where cultural understanding is crucial. You obviously have expertise in Arab-American relations, and you clearly have no problem telling me when I'm being an idiot. I could use someone like that on my team." You want to pay me to tell you when you're being an idiot? Heather asked, incredulous. Among other things, Khalid said, and there was the faintest hint of humor in his voice now. I'd pay you $10,000 a week, plus cover any expenses. You'd attend meetings with me, advise me on cultural nuances, help me avoid making the kind of catastrophic mistakes I made when we first met. Think of it as sensitivity training with a very willing student. Heather stared at him. That's insane. It's business, Khalid corrected. I lose millions when deals fall apart because of cultural misunderstandings. You'd be saving me money in the long run. Or you could just read a book about American culture, Heather pointed out. I've read 12, Khalid said seriously. I'm still terrible at applying the theory. I need practical experience, and I need someone who won't let me get away with my worst impulses. He paused. Also, selfishly, I'd like a chance to prove to you that I'm not the person you met last week, or at least that I'm trying not to be. There it was, the real reason, slipping past his business justification. Heather saw it in the way his posture shifted, the vulnerability that flickered across his face before he locked it away behind that controlled exterior. This is a terrible idea, she said slowly. Probably, Khalid agreed. I don't even like you. That's fair. I haven't given you much reason to, and I don't trust wealthy men who think they can buy anything, including people's good opinions. Khalid nodded, accepting the hit. Also fair, but I'm not trying to buy your good opinion, Heather. I'm trying to earn it. There's a difference. Heather wanted to say no. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was a trap, that men like Khalid al-Rahman didn't change, that she'd be setting herself up for disappointment or worse. But another part, the part that had spent 3 years serving people who barely saw her as human, the part that loved languages and cultures and the complicated spaces between them, that part was desperately curious. What happened next shocked everyone, including herself. I'll do it, she heard herself say, but I have conditions. Khalid's eyes lit up, and that dangerous smile returned. Name them. First, this is strictly professional. No personal complications, no crossing boundaries. You're hiring me as a consultant, nothing more. Agreed. Second, if you're disrespectful to anyone, waiters, assistants, anyone, the contract is void immediately. No second chances. Understood. Third, I keep my job here at Meridian. I'll work around my schedule, but I'm not giving up my income security for a temporary position. I'll work around your schedule, Khalid promised. Anything else? Heather thought for a moment. Yes. You have to actually listen to my advice, not just nod and ignore it. If you hire me, you have to be willing to be challenged, to be uncomfortable, to have your assumptions questioned. Otherwise, this is just performative, and we're both wasting our time. For a long moment, Khalid said nothing. Then he extended his hand across the table. You have a deal, Ms. Martinez. When can you start? Heather looked at his hand. Elegant, expensive watch glinting on his wrist, fingers that had probably never done manual labor in their life. She thought about her tiny apartment, her student loans, her research that needed funding. She thought about the way this man had insulted her and then genuinely tried to make amends. She thought about how she had no idea what she was getting herself into. She shook his hand. Tomorrow night, you're taking me to one of your business dinners, and I'm going to teach you how to not be terrible. Khalid's smile widened into something that sent an unwelcome flutter through her stomach. I look forward to being educated. As Heather stood to return to work, Carlos caught her eye from across the restaurant, giving her a thumbs up that suggested Khalid had indeed cleared her extended break. She rolled her eyes but couldn't quite suppress her own smile. Behind her, Khalid watched her walk away, and for the first time in years he felt something other than the hollow satisfaction of closing another business deal. He felt anticipation, curiosity, and beneath it all, the uncomfortable recognition that this young woman had cracked something open in him that he'd thought was permanently sealed. He didn't know it yet, but he had just made the most important business decision of his life, and it had nothing to do with business at all. The following evening, Heather stood outside the Plaza Hotel trying not to feel intimidated. She dressed carefully in a simple black dress she'd worn to her graduate thesis defense, elegant enough to fit in, modest enough to maintain professional boundaries. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, small pearl earrings her only jewelry. A black Mercedes pulled up to the curb, and Khalid emerged from the back seat. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe, his hair perfectly styled, every inch the billionaire businessman. But when he saw her, his expression softened into something genuine. "You look beautiful," he said, then quickly added, "professionally beautiful, appropriately beautiful for a business dinner." Despite her nerves, Heather laughed. "Smooth recovery." "I'm trying," Khalid said with a self-deprecating smile. "Already failing, apparently. This is why I need you." He gestured toward the hotel entrance. "Tonight, I'm meeting with Marcus Chen, CEO of Chen Development. He's considering a partnership to build 3 luxury hotels in Dubai. The deal is worth about $2 billion, and I've somehow managed to offend him in every previous interaction." "How?" Heather asked as they walked through the ornate lobby. "I'm not entirely sure," Khalid admitted. "I think it's something about my communication style. He keeps saying I'm too aggressive, too direct. But in my culture, directness is respected. It's efficient. I don't understand why Americans find it rude." Heather stopped walking, causing Khalid to pause and look back at her questioningly. "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You're approaching this like there's a right way and a wrong way to communicate, when really there are just different ways. Neither is superior. You need to adapt to your audience, not expect them to understand your cultural framework." Khalid considered this, something shifting in his expression. "Show me how." For the next 10 minutes, in a quiet corner of the Plaza's lobby, Heather gave him a crash course in American business communication. The importance of small talk, the softening phrases that made requests feel like suggestions, the subtle art of indirect criticism that Americans preferred to confrontational honesty. "So, instead of saying, 'This proposal is inadequate,'" Khalid repeated slowly, "I should say, 'I think there might be some areas we could strengthen together.'" "Exactly," Heather confirmed. "It's not dishonest, it's diplomatic. You're still communicating the same information, just in a way that preserves the relationship and invites collaboration rather than triggering defensiveness." Khalid shook his head wonderingly. "This is exhausting. How do Americans get anything done?" "We manage," Heather said dryly. "Ready?" "No," Khalid admitted, "but let's do it anyway." Marcus Chen was already seated in the hotel's private dining room when they arrived, a man in his late 40s with silver-streaked hair and an expression of polite wariness. He stood as they entered, shaking Khalid's hand with professional courtesy that lacked warmth. "Mr. Al-Rahman," he said, "thank you for arranging this meeting." "Thank you for giving me another chance," Khalid replied, and Heather noted with approval that he'd softened his usual commanding tone. "I'd like to introduce Heather Martinez, my cultural liaison consultant. She's here to help ensure I don't accidentally insult you again." The unexpected honesty broke through Chen's reserve. He laughed, surprised. "That's remarkably self-aware." "Heather is teaching me self-awareness," Khalid said, pulling out a chair for her, another gesture Heather hadn't expected. "It's a humbling process." The dinner that followed was a revelation. Heather watched Khalid navigate the conversation with uncharacteristic care, asking about Chen's family before business, softening his natural directness with the phrases she'd taught him, actually listening when Chen spoke instead of planning his next point. It wasn't perfect. Twice she had to gently kick his ankle under the table when he started to slip into aggressive mode, but it was genuine effort. I appreciate your flexibility on the timeline, Chen was saying over dessert, noticeably more relaxed than he'd been at the start. In our previous discussions, I felt pressured to commit before I was ready. This feels more like a partnership. That's exactly what it should be, Khalid said. And Heather could hear the effort it took him to not add something about efficiency or business sense. I want you to feel completely comfortable with every aspect of this deal. After Chen left, promising to have his lawyers draft a preliminary agreement, Khalid turned to Heather with something like wonder in his eyes. That actually worked. You did the hard part, Heather said. I just gave you the tools. You chose to use them. Dance with me, Khalid said suddenly. Heather blinked. What? The hotel has a ballroom on the second floor. I can hear the music from here. He stood, offering his hand. Dance with me, please, to celebrate not destroying a $2 billion deal. That's not professional, Heather protested, even as her heart rate picked up. You're right, Khalid said, not withdrawing his hand. It's not. But I'm asking anyway, because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel like celebrating something real. Not just a business victory, but the fact that I might actually be capable of change. And I want to share that moment with the person who made it possible. There were 1,000 reasons to say no, but Heather found herself taking his hand. The ballroom was hosting a wedding reception, the edges filled with elegant couples swaying to a jazz quartet. Khalid led her to a quiet corner where the music reached but the crowd thinned, and pulled her into a traditional waltz position with surprising grace. You know how to waltz, Heather observed as they began to move. My mother insisted, Khalid said. She said a man who couldn't dance couldn't truly understand partnership. The give and take, the need to move together, to anticipate without controlling. He paused. I think I'm finally understanding what she meant. They danced in silence for a moment, and Heather became acutely aware of everywhere their bodies touched. His hand warm on her waist, her fingers resting on his shoulder, the subtle pressure of his palm against hers. He smelled like cedar and amber again, and up this close she could see flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Tell me something real about yourself, Khalid said quietly, something not in your impressive resume. Heather hesitated, then decided honesty deserved honesty. I grew up in a trailer park in New Mexico. My mother cleaned houses for a living. My father left before I was born. I was the first person in my family to go to college. Everything I've achieved, I've had to fight for twice as hard as people who started with more. And sometimes, when I'm serving wealthy people who don't even see me as human, I wonder if all that fighting was worth it. Khalid's hand tightened slightly on her waist. It was worth it, he said with quiet intensity. Because you didn't just fight for yourself. You fought to prove that the system is wrong about people like you. Every degree you earned, every language you mastered, every time you refused to be invisible, that's you changing the world, one assumption at a time. He paused. The way you changed mine. Heather looked up at him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. This moment would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. Your turn, she said. Tell me something real. Khalid was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My father built our empire from nothing. He was brilliant, driven, impossible to please. When he died, everyone expected me to fail, to prove I was just a spoiled son who'd inherited more than he could handle. So I became twice as ruthless as he'd been, twice as cold, worked twice as hard. I haven't taken a real vacation in 9 years. I haven't had a conversation that wasn't about business in longer than that. And until you called me out last week, I'd convinced myself that loneliness was just the price of success. What changed? Heather asked softly. You looked at me like I was human, Khalid said simply. Not a billionaire. Not a business opportunity, not someone to impress or fear or manipulate, just a man who was being cruel and needed to be better. Nobody's looked at me like that in years, and I realized I'd spent so long being what everyone expected that I'd forgotten how to be anything else. The song ended, but neither of them moved. They stood there in the corner of the ballroom, strangers swirling around them, caught in a moment that felt suspended from time. "We should go," Heather finally said, stepping back reluctantly. "This is getting complicated." "I know," Khalid agreed, but his eyes said he didn't want to leave any more than she did. "Same time next week? I have a meeting with a real estate developer who hates me." "Why does he hate you?" "I may have called his architectural plans uninspired and derivative," Khalid admitted. Heather groaned. "You're going to be a lot of work. Is that a yes?" Despite everything, the warning bells, the professional boundaries, the absolute certainty that this was dangerous territory, Heather smiled. "Yes. But next time, we're establishing stricter rules about what counts as professional celebration." "Oh, whatever you say," Khalid agreed, but there was a warmth in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely sorry for crossing the line. "Let me take you home." "I can take the subway." "Heather," Khalid said gently, "let me take you home. Not because I think you can't manage yourself, but because I want 5 more minutes of your company, and I'm hoping you might want the same." She should have said no. Instead, she nodded. In the back of the Mercedes, they sat on opposite sides of the seat, maintaining professional distance even as the air between them hummed with something neither wanted to name. Khalid asked her about her research, and she found herself telling him about her dissertation plans, her passion for bridging cultural divides, the way language could be both a barrier and a bridge. "You light up when you talk about it," Khalid observed. "The way other people talk about falling in love." "I do love it," Heather said. "It's the only thing I've ever loved that loved me back." Something flickered across Khalid's face. Understanding, sadness, recognition. Before he could respond, the car pulled up in front of her building in Queens, a modest brownstone conversion that probably cost less per month than Khalid spent on suits. "Thank you for tonight," Heather said, gathering her bag. "You did well." "We did well," Khalid corrected. Then, hesitantly, "Heather, would you consider having dinner with me? Not for business, just because I'd like to know you better." "That's exactly what I said we couldn't do," Heather reminded him. "I know. You're right. Forget I asked." Khalid looked away, jaw tight. "I'll see you next week." Heather opened the car door, stepped halfway out, then stopped. This was the moment where she could walk away, keep this professional, protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak of getting involved with someone from a completely different world. She turned back. "Ask me again in a month, after we've proven we can maintain professional boundaries. If you still want to, then I'll consider it." Khalid's smile could have powered the entire city. "1 month. I'm marking my calendar." As Heather watched the Mercedes drive away, she leaned against her building's door and tried to calm her racing heart. She'd just agreed to something that was definitely, absolutely, certainly a terrible idea. But little did she know, it was also the best decision she'd ever make. The month that followed tested Heather's resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. Khalid was true to his word about maintaining professional boundaries, mostly. He never made overtly personal advances, never tried to manipulate her into more than their agreed arrangement. But there were moments that felt like standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying, the way his hand would linger on her back when guiding her through a door, the intensity in his eyes when she explained a cultural concept, the texts that arrived late at night asking her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with business. They attended 7 meetings together over those 4 weeks. Heather watched Khalid transform from the arrogant man she'd first encountered into someone more thoughtful, more aware, more willing to admit when he was wrong. He still had moments of frustration, his natural directness chafing against the indirect American style, but he was trying, really trying. The turning point came 3 weeks into their arrangement, at a charity gala where Khalid was being honored for his philanthropic work in Middle Eastern education initiatives. Heather attended as his +1, wearing a dress he'd sent to her apartment with a note, "For professional appearances only. I promise I'm not trying to buy you, but you deserve something beautiful for beautiful work. K." The dress was midnight blue, elegant and modest, but undeniably expensive. Heather had nearly sent it back. Instead, she'd kept it and told herself it was just practical business attire. At the gala, surrounded by New York's elite, Khalid was in his element, charming donors, discussing investment opportunities, navigating the complex social hierarchy with newfound grace. Heather stayed close, offering quiet corrections when needed, but mostly just watching him work. Then an older man approached them, Senator Richard Hartley, a prominent conservative politician known for his controversial stance on immigration. He shook Khalid's hand with practiced warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Al-Rahman," Hartley said, "impressive work you're doing. Though I have to wonder why you're focused on education in the Middle East when we have so many problems here at home. Seems like charity should begin in your own country, doesn't it?" The implication was clear. You're not really American, so why should we care about your philanthropy? Heather felt her muscles tense, preparing to intervene. But Khalid surprised her. "You raise an interesting point, Senator," he said calmly, without a trace of the aggressive defensiveness she'd expected. "Which is why I also fund scholarship programs for underprivileged American students, including 5 full-ride scholarships at Columbia University, specifically for first-generation college students from low-income backgrounds. One of which, incidentally, was awarded to my consultant here, Ms. Martinez, 6 years ago." Heather's breath caught. She stared at Khalid, who met her eyes briefly before turning back to Hartley. "I believe," Khalid continued, his voice still pleasant, but with an edge of steel, "that charity doesn't have borders, Senator. Neither does human potential. The same barriers that keep a girl in rural Iraq from accessing education exist in different forms in rural Arkansas. If we only help our own, however we define that, we miss the opportunity to recognize that we're all connected, that investing in one person's education anywhere in the world ultimately benefits everyone." Hartley's smile had frozen. He mumbled something about speaking to other donors and retreated quickly. Once he was gone, Heather grabbed Khalid's arm and pulled him toward a quiet corner behind a marble column. "You funded my scholarship?" Khalid had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "I fund many scholarships. Don't deflect. How did you even know about that?" "I may have looked into your background after our first meeting," Khalid admitted. "I wanted to understand who you were, what you'd overcome. When I saw your scholarship was from the Al-Rahman Foundation, He paused, choosing his words carefully. It felt like fate, like the universe arranging for us to meet. "You looked into my background," Heather repeated, torn between anger and something else she couldn't quite name. "That's invasive, Khalid." "You're right," he said immediately. "I'm sorry. I should have asked permission. I should have—" "Stop!" Heather interrupted, because she could see he was genuinely distressed. She took a breath, trying to sort through her tangled emotions. "How much did you read?" "Everything that was publicly available," Khalid said quietly. "Your academic records, your published research papers, your undergraduate thesis on linguistic preservation in immigrant communities. I read about your mother, about growing up without much money but with tremendous determination. I read about how you worked 3 jobs to afford application fees for graduate school." He met her eyes. "I read about someone who refused to let circumstances define her limitations. Someone extraordinary." "You can't do that," Heather said, but her voice had lost its sharp edge. "You can't just research people like they're business acquisitions." "I know. I'm sorry." Khalid ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its perfect styling. "I'm still learning where the boundaries are. I'm used to gathering information on anyone I work with. It's standard in my world. But you're right, it was invasive. It was wrong. I apologize." Heather studied him. This complicated man who could be thoughtlessly arrogant and genuinely humble in the same breath, who funded scholarships for strangers but didn't think twice about invading privacy, who was trying so hard to change while still stumbling over his own privilege. "My scholarship was $50,000, she said slowly. "It changed my entire life. If you hadn't funded that program, I wouldn't have been able to attend Columbia. I wouldn't have the career I have now. In a way, you've been impacting my life for 6 years without me even knowing it." "Does that bother you?" Khalid asked. "I don't know yet," Heather admitted, "but I think I'm glad I know now." They stood there in the shadow of the marble column, the sounds of the gala muted around them, crystal clinking, laughter, the string quartet playing something classical and elegant. Khalid looked at her with an expression that made her heart do dangerous things in her chest. "3 more weeks," he said quietly. "Then I'm going to ask you to dinner again. A real dinner, not business. And I really hope you'll say yes, because this month has been the longest month of my life." "You barely know me," Heather protested, but she could hear the weakness in her own argument. "I know you take your coffee black because you got used to bad office coffee and trained yourself not to need sugar," Khalid said. "I know you unconsciously switch languages when you're thinking hard about something, usually to Spanish, occasionally to Arabic. I know you bite your lower lip when you're trying not to laugh at something I've said. I know you're brilliant and compassionate and brave, and that you see people really see them, in a way most people have forgotten how to do." He paused. "I know that 3 weeks feels like forever when I'm counting down to when I can tell you all of this without breaking our agreement." Heather's breath had gone shallow. "Khalid, I know," he said, stepping back slightly, giving her space. "Professional boundaries. I'm not trying to pressure you. I just wanted you to know that when I ask you in 3 weeks, it won't be a casual question. It will be because I've spent a month learning what it means to be better, and realizing that being better means being honest about what I want. And what I want is a chance to know you outside of conference rooms and business dinners. A chance to see if this thing between us is as real as it feels." Before Heather could respond, before she could even process what to say, a crash echoed across the ballroom, followed by raised voices. They both turned to see a commotion near the bar. A young waiter had dropped a tray of champagne glasses, and an elderly man in an expensive tuxedo was berating him loudly, his face red with anger. "Incompetent fool! Do you know how much this tux costs? Look at this stain!" Heather felt Khalid tense beside her. She touched his arm gently. "Let me handle this." She crossed the ballroom quickly, Khalid following at a respectful distance. The waiter was young, maybe 20, clearly new to this kind of event, his hands shaking as he tried to pick up broken glass while the angry man continued to shout at him. "Excuse me," Heather said pleasantly, inserting herself between them. "Sir, I'm so sorry for the accident. I'm sure we can get your tux cleaned. The venue will cover any costs." Who are you?" the man snapped. "Someone who recognizes that accidents happen," Heather replied calmly, "and that yelling at this young man isn't going to clean your suit any faster. Why don't you go to the coat check? I'm sure they can help you there." The man sputtered indignantly, but several other guests had gathered, and the social pressure of an audience watching his bad behavior was enough to make him retreat. Once he was gone, Heather knelt beside the waiter, who looked close to tears. "You okay?" she asked gently. "I'm so sorry," the kid whispered. "He bumped into me, but I should have been more careful. I'm going to get fired." "No, you're not," Khalid said, appearing beside them. He'd already signaled to the venue staff, who rushed over with brooms and cleaning supplies. To the waiter, he said, "I saw what happened. He wasn't watching where he was going. This wasn't your fault." The kid looked up at Khalid, recognizing him clearly from the evening's earlier speeches, and his eyes went wide. "Mr. Al-Rahman, You're doing a great job," Khalid interrupted firmly. "And anyone who says otherwise will answer to me. What's your name?" "Marcus, sir." "Marcus, I'm going to speak to your manager and make sure this is recorded correctly. And I'd like your information so I can send you something to make up for that man's terrible behavior." Khalid pulled out his phone. "What's your Venmo?" 10 minutes later, after ensuring Marcus wouldn't face any repercussions and confirming that Khalid had sent him $1,000 for his trouble, Heather and Khalid stepped out onto the venue's terrace for some air. "You didn't have to do that," Heather said. "Yes, I did," Khalid replied, "because a month ago I would have been that angry man. Maybe not as loud, maybe more coldly polite, but I would have blamed the waiter without thinking twice. I would have seen his mistake instead of his humanity." He looked at her. "You've changed how I see the world, Heather. You've changed how I see people. That's worth more than any business deal I've ever closed." Heather felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. She blinked them away quickly, but not before Khalid noticed. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked, concerned. "No," Heather said. "You said something right. Maybe the rightest thing anyone's ever said to me." She laughed shakily. "And that terrifies me because I wasn't supposed to start caring about you. This was supposed to stay professional." Khalid's expression softened into something achingly tender. "For what it's worth, I wasn't supposed to start caring about you either. But here we are." "Here we are," Heather echoed. They stood there on the terrace, New York glittering around them like something out of a dream, both of them acutely aware that the boundaries they'd carefully constructed were becoming increasingly irrelevant. What happened next would change everything, but neither of them was ready to acknowledge it yet. The night air was cool, carrying the distant sounds of the city, and between them hung the unspoken recognition that 3 weeks might as well be 3 years. Some things couldn't be contained by arbitrary timelines or professional agreements. Some things were inevitable. Everything fell apart on a Tuesday. Heather was at Meridian working her regular shift when her phone buzzed with a text from Khalid. "Emergency. Can you come to the plaza? Now?" She'd made an excuse to Carlos and arrived 20 minutes later to find Khalid pacing in a private conference room, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, tie loosened, hair a mess from running his hands through it. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. "My mother," Khalid said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "She's in the hospital in Dubai. Heart attack. They don't know if she's going to make it. I have a flight leaving in 3 hours." "Oh my God, Khalid!" Heather crossed the room without thinking, reaching for his hand. "I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" "Come with me," Khalid said, gripping her hand like a lifeline. "Please. I know it's asking too much. I know it's crossing every boundary we set, but I can't." He stopped, composed himself with visible effort. "I can't face this alone. My mother is all I have left. If she dies, He couldn't finish the sentence. Heather's mind raced. She had shifts scheduled, bills due, responsibilities she couldn't just abandon. Going to Dubai with him would blur every line they'd carefully maintained. It would be admitting that this was more than professional, more than friendship, more than anything they could easily define or control. "Okay," she heard herself say. "Okay, I'll come." The relief that flooded Khalid's face made her decision worth whatever complications would follow. The flight to Dubai was long and tense. Khalid spent most of it working, making calls, sending emails, managing his business empire remotely, because stopping would mean thinking about what waited for him at the hospital. Heather sat beside him in the first-class cabin, occasionally touching his arm when his hands shook, bringing him water he didn't drink, being present in the only way she knew how. Somewhere over the Atlantic, around 3 in the morning New York time, Khalid finally stopped pretending to work. He closed his laptop and turned to Heather, exhaustion written in every line of his face. "Tell me about your mother," he said quietly. So Heather did. She told him about a woman who cleaned houses for wealthy families, but always had time to help with homework, who never finished high school herself, but made sure her daughter read every night, who worked 2 jobs, so Heather could take Arabic lessons from a neighbor who believed education was the only inheritance that couldn't be taken away. "She sounds remarkable," Khalid said. "She is," Heather agreed. "I call her every Sunday. She still can't believe I work with billionaires." She paused. "What's your mother like?" Khalid smiled, sad and fond simultaneously. "Strong, impossible to argue with. She was the one who insisted my father educate me in Western schools, who made sure I understood that wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege. After he died, she was the only person who told me I was allowed to grieve instead of just stepping up to run the company." His voice went rough. "She told me last year that I'd become too hard, too isolated, that I needed to remember how to be human before the business consumed me entirely. I brushed her off, said I was fine." "You were listening, though," Heather said gently. "Maybe not consciously, but some part of you heard her. Why else would you have been so affected when I called you out?" Khalid turned to look at her, and in the dim cabin light, his expression was achingly vulnerable. "I don't know what I'll do if I lose her." "You'll survive," Heather said firmly, "because that's what we do. We survive the unsurvivable, and we find ways to honor the people we've lost by becoming better than we were. You're already doing that." Khalid reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I'm glad you're here." "Me too," Heather whispered, and knew with absolute certainty that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. They arrived in Dubai at dawn, the city gleaming gold and white against the desert sky. A car rushed them directly to the hospital, where Khalid's mother was in the cardiac intensive care unit, stable but critical. She was asleep when they arrived, tubes and monitors surrounding her bed, looking smaller and more fragile than Heather had imagined from Khalid's descriptions. Khalid stood frozen in the doorway, his composure finally cracking. Heather stayed close, one hand on his back, grounding him as he processed the sight of his formidable mother, reduced to this. "You must be Khalid," a doctor said, approaching them. "I'm Dr. Amari. Your mother is stable for now. The next 48 hours are critical. We're monitoring her closely." "Can I sit with her?" Khalid asked. "Of course." "And you are?" Dr. Amari looked at Heather. Heather started, unsure how to define herself. "She's family," Khalid said firmly, not looking away from his mother. "She stays with me." They spent 3 days in that hospital room. Khalid rarely left his mother's side, talking to her even when she was unconscious, holding her hand, occasionally breaking down when he thought Heather wasn't watching. Heather brought him food he barely ate, kept him company during the long night hours, and called his key executives to handle urgent business matters when he was too exhausted to function. On the 3rd day, his mother woke up. "Khalid," she whispered, her voice weak, but her eyes sharp as ever. "You look terrible, Habibi." Khalid laughed, a sound caught between relief and tears. "I've been worried about you, Mama." "I'm too stubborn to die yet," she said. Then her gaze shifted to Heather, standing respectfully near the door. "And who is this beautiful girl?" "This is Heather Martinez," Khalid said, gesturing for Heather to come closer. She's the woman I told you about in my emails, the one who's been helping me be better." Recognition flickered in his mother's eyes, along with something that looked like approval. "Ah, the one who called you an arrogant fool in Arabic." Heather felt her face heat. "I didn't exactly—" "Good," Khalid's mother interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "He needed someone to do that. Come here, child. Heather approached the bed, and Khalid's mother took her hand with surprising strength. She studied Heather's face for a long moment, then looked at her son. "She has kind eyes," his mother said in Arabic. "And brave. You could do worse." "Mama," Khalid said, embarrassed. It's not like that." His mother smiled knowingly. "Of course not. That's why you flew her across the world to sit by your side during the worst moment of your life, because it's not like that." She squeezed Heather's hand. "Thank you for taking care of my stubborn son." "He takes care of himself," Heather replied in Arabic, making the older woman's eyes light up with delight. "She speaks our language. Khalid, you didn't tell me she speaks our language." "I told you she has a master's in Middle Eastern studies," Khalid protested. "That's not the same thing," his mother said. "Languages in books are different from languages in the heart. This girl speaks from the heart." She looked between them, something calculating entering her expression. "How long are you staying?" "I'll stay as long as you need me," Khalid said immediately. "I need you to stop hovering and show this girl your city," his mother commanded. "I'm not dying today. Dr. Amari already told me I'll be here at least another week, being poked and prodded and lectured about my diet. You can't sit here staring at me the whole time. It's unsettling." "Mama, that's not a request, Khalid. That's your mother telling you to go live your life for a few hours. Take Heather somewhere beautiful. Show her why Dubai is worth loving." She closed her eyes, already tired from the brief conversation. "And bring me back some decent coffee. This hospital coffee is an insult." Outside the hospital room, Khalid leaned against the wall and let out a shaky breath. "I'm sorry, she's very direct." "I like her," Heather said honestly. "She reminds me of you, before you learned to hide it behind business politeness." Khalid smiled faintly. "She's right, though. I should show you the city. You flew halfway around the world, and all you've seen is a hospital room." "I didn't come for tourism," Heather pointed out. "I know, but humor me anyway." Khalid looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I want to share this place with you. It's important to me that you understand where I come from, what shaped me, and selfishly, I need a few hours to feel like the world isn't ending." How could she say no to that? Dubai at sunset was breathtaking. Khalid took her to the top of the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, where they watched the city light up like a circuit board against the darkening desert. He took her to the old souks, where the smell of spices and gold filled the narrow streets, so different from the gleaming modern towers that dominated the skyline. He took her to a small restaurant his mother loved, where they ate lamb tagine that put every American version to shame, and he told her stories about growing up between worlds, Arab tradition and Western education, family expectations and personal dreams. "My mother used to say that being caught between cultures meant you could build bridges others couldn't see," Khalid said over mint tea. "I spent years thinking she was trying to make me feel better about not fitting perfectly anywhere. But lately I've been wondering if she was right, if being between is actually its own kind of belonging." "It is," Heather said. "That's what my research is about, the people who live in the spaces between languages, between cultures, who translate not just words but entire ways of seeing the world. They're not lost, they're pioneers." Khalid reached across the table, taking her hand. "Is that what you are? A pioneer?" "I'm trying to be," Heather said. "Some days I feel like I'm just faking it until I figure out where I actually belong." "You belong here," Khalid said quietly. "With me, if you want that." The restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them and the truth they'd been avoiding for weeks. Heather knew she should pull her hand back, should remind him about professional boundaries, should protect herself from the inevitable complications of falling for someone from such a different world. Instead, she squeezed his hand tighter. "Your mother almost died. You're vulnerable. This isn't the time to make decisions about us," Khalid finished. "You're right. This is terrible timing. Everything about this is terrible timing. But here's what I know. I've spent the last 3 days facing the possibility of losing the person who matters most to me in the world. And the only thing that made it bearable was having you beside me. That means something, Heather. Something I can't ignore anymore, regardless of timing. We're from completely different worlds, Heather protested weakly. So we'll build a bridge, Khalid said. Isn't that what pioneers do? Before Heather could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted immediately to concern. It's the hospital. They made it back in 15 minutes. Dr. Amari met them in the hallway, and Heather's heart sank at his expression. Your mother's had another episode, he said to Khalid. A minor one, but it's concerning. We need to discuss more aggressive treatment options, possibly surgery. Everything that had felt important minutes ago, confessions, feelings, possibilities, evaporated in the face of new crisis. Khalid went into that conference room with the doctors, and Heather waited outside, realizing with stark clarity that she'd fallen in love with a man whose life was infinitely more complicated than hers, whose responsibilities spanned continents, whose grief and joy and fear were all magnified by the weight of his world. And somehow, impossibly, that didn't make her want to run. It made her want to stay. Khalid's mother had the surgery the next morning. It was successful, the doctors said, though recovery would take months. She'd need rest, careful monitoring, lifestyle changes. But she would live. Heather watched the tension drain from Khalid's body when Dr. Amari delivered the news, saw him lean against the wall with his eyes closed, breathing like he'd just surfaced from underwater. She wanted to go to him, to hold him. But there were too many people around, doctors, nurses, Khalid's business associates who'd flown in to offer support. Later, in the quiet of the hospital cafeteria at 2 a.m, Khalid finally let himself break. Heather held him while he cried. This powerful man who'd spent his entire adult life being strong for everyone else. And she understood with perfect clarity that she was seeing a side of him almost no one else ever had. Thank you, he whispered when he could speak again, for being here, for all of it. I don't know how to repay. You don't repay this, Heather interrupted gently. This is what people do when they care about each other. No debt, no transaction. Just being there. Khalid pulled back to look at her, his eyes red but clearer than she'd seen them in days. I'm in love with you, he said quietly. I know the timing is terrible. I know we said we'd wait. I know there are 1,000 practical reasons why this is complicated. But I'm in love with you, Heather Martinez, and I need you to know that before another crisis happens and I lose the chance to tell you. Heather's heart felt too large for her chest. Khalid, you don't have to say it back, he continued quickly. I'm not expecting anything. I just needed you to know. You've changed my entire life in the space of a few weeks. You've made me want to be better, do better, see better. And somewhere in that process, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with you. Heather thought about all the reasons to be careful. The differences in their wealth, their backgrounds, their worlds. She thought about how this could end badly, how loving someone with this much responsibility and complication could break her heart in ways she'd never recover from. Then she thought about the past week, about flying across the world without hesitation, about holding his hand in hospital rooms, about the way his smile transformed his entire face, about feeling, for the first time in her life, like she'd found someone who saw her, really saw her, and loved what he found. I'm in love with you too, she said, and watched joy break across his features like sunrise. I have been for weeks. I was just too scared to admit it. Khalid kissed her then, soft and careful and full of promise, tasting of tears and coffee and relief. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. What do we do now? He asked. We figure it out, Heather said. One day at a time, no guarantees, no perfect plans, Just two people trying to build a bridge between their worlds and hoping it holds. I can work with that, Khalid said, and kissed her again. They stayed in Dubai for another week, while Khalid's mother recovered. Heather got to know the woman better, her sharp wit, her fierce protectiveness of her son, her approval of Heather that she expressed through pointed comments about Khalid finally finding someone with sense. They had dinner at his mother's favorite restaurants, walked through markets where Khalid had played as a child, visited his family's original home, a modest house in an older neighborhood that he'd kept despite having a penthouse in the newest tower. "This is where I remember being happiest," Khalid admitted as they stood in the small courtyard. "Before my father got rich, before the pressure started, when we were just a family. I come here sometimes when I need to remember who I am underneath all the rest." "Thank you for showing me," Heather said, understanding the gift of vulnerability he was offering. On their last evening, Khalid's mother insisted on having tea with them in her hospital room, which had been upgraded to something more like a hotel suite given Khalid's influence and resources. "I want to talk to you both about something serious," she said, and Heather felt a flutter of nervousness. "Khalid, you know I love you, and I can see you love this girl, but love alone doesn't solve the practical problems of very different lives." "Mama," Khalid started, but she held up a hand. "I'm not saying don't be together. I'm saying be smart about it. Heather, you have your own life, your own dreams, your own path. Don't give that up to become an accessory to my son's world. And Khalid, don't expect her to. If you love her, you make space for her to be fully herself, not just a beautiful addition to your life." "I understand," Khalid said seriously. His mother turned to Heather. "And you, don't let him intimidate you with his money, or his power, or his tendency to try to solve every problem by throwing resources at it. He needs someone who will challenge him, who will maintain their own ground, who won't let him forget what matters beyond business deals." "I won't," Heather promised. "Good." The older woman smiled. "Then you have my blessing. Now go home, both of you. Khalid, your business needs you. And Heather, you have a life waiting in New York. Long distance will be hard, but it will also show you if this is real." Back in New York, reality set in quickly. Khalid had to return to Dubai twice in the following month for business and to check on his mother. Heather went back to her waitressing shifts and her research, trying to figure out how to balance a relationship with someone who lived on private jets and split his time between continents while she struggled to pay rent in Queens. They talked every day, video calls in the middle of the night when their time zones aligned, texts throughout the day sharing small moments and important thoughts. But it was hard, harder than either of them had anticipated. The breaking point came 6 weeks after Dubai. Heather was at Meridian, exhausted from a double shift, when a customer complained that she'd gotten his order wrong. He was rude, dismissive, speaking to her like she was stupid. Normally she could handle it. 3 years of waitressing had given her thick skin. But that day, worn down by too little sleep and too much missing Khalid, she felt something crack. She walked out mid-shift. Carlos called after her, confused and concerned. But she kept walking. She walked all the way to her apartment, climbed the stairs to her tiny studio, and sat on her bed, staring at the wall. Her phone rang. "Khalid calling from Dubai." "I can't do this," Heather said instead of hello. There was a pause, then, carefully, "Can't do what?" "This, us. I just walked out of my job because a customer was rude to me, which is ridiculous because customers are always rude. But I'm exhausted, Khalid. I miss you constantly. I can't focus on my research because I'm always thinking about when I'll see you next. And when we are together, I'm aware of how different our lives are. You fly first class and I take the subway. You wear suits that cost more than my monthly rent. Your problems are multi-billion-dollar deals, and mine are whether I can afford groceries and student loan payments in the same week." "Heather, let me finish," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "I love you. I really do. But I don't know how to be with someone when our lives are this different. I don't know how to not feel like I'm playing dress-up in your world, or like you're slumming it when you visit mine. And I don't want to resent you for having resources I don't have, but some days I do, and that makes me feel terrible. Silence. Long enough that Heather thought maybe the call had dropped. Then Khalid said very quietly, "What if I moved to New York, permanently?" Heather's breath caught. "What?" "I've been thinking about it for weeks," Khalid said. "Most of my business can be managed remotely. I have excellent people running the day-to-day operations. I could relocate my base to New York, buy an apartment there, be present in your life instead of just a voice on the phone. Would that help?" "You can't upend your entire life for me," Heather protested. "Why not?" Khalid asked. "You flew to Dubai without hesitation when I needed you. You held my hand through the worst week of my life. You've challenged me to be better in every possible way. Why is it acceptable for you to rearrange your life for me, but not for me to do the same for you?" "Because you're a billionaire," Heather said. "You have responsibilities." "And you don't?" Khalid interrupted. "You have a doctoral program to complete, research that matters, a career you're building. Your dreams are no less important than my business deals, Heather. Actually, they're more important because they're about understanding and bridging divides, not just making money." Heather wiped her tears, trying to process what he was offering. "You'd really move here?" "I'd really move there," Khalid confirmed. "I'd also like to pay off your student loans, but I know you'll probably say no to that, so I'll settle for being present in your life and supporting your work in whatever ways you'll allow." "What do you say?" What could she say? When? "Give me 2 weeks to arrange things on this end, then I'm yours, permanently, if you'll have me." 2 weeks later, Khalid al-Rahman moved into a penthouse in Manhattan, not far from Heather's neighborhood in Queens, close enough for real dates and spontaneous visits. He hired new executives to manage his Middle Eastern operations remotely. He set up an office in New York. He started appearing at Meridian for dinner, not as a customer for Heather to serve, but as her partner, waiting for her shift to end so they could walk home together. Carlos took Heather aside one evening, about 3 months after Khalid's move. "That man is planning something," he said. "He called me last week asking about your favorite desserts, your schedule, whether you had any days off coming up. What's he planning?" "I have no idea," Heather admitted, though her heart was racing with possibility. The answer came that weekend. Khalid took her to the rooftop of his building at sunset. New York spread out below them, the city they'd both chosen as their meeting ground between worlds. There was a table set up with candles and flowers, soft music playing from hidden speakers. "This is beautiful," Heather said. "But you know I would have been happy with takeout on my couch." "I know," Khalid said, smiling, "but humor me. I want to do this right." He took her hand, and Heather's breath caught because she suddenly knew exactly what was happening. 6 months ago, Khalid began, I walked into a restaurant planning to close a business deal. Instead, I met a woman who spoke Arabic and wasn't impressed by my money and saw right through every defense I'd built around myself. I was arrogant and cruel, and she called me on it without hesitation, and in that moment, my entire life changed direction. "Khalid, let me finish," he said gently. "You've taught me what it means to truly see people. You've shown me that bridges between worlds aren't just possible, they're essential. You've made me want to be better, not for business success or public approval, but because being better means being worthy of you." He got down on one knee, pulling out a small box. "I know 6 months isn't very long. I know we still have things to figure out. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life building a world with you, one where both our dreams matter, where both our backgrounds are honored, where we create something new that belongs to both of us." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, with a single diamond that caught the sunset light. "Heather Martinez, will you marry me?" Heather looked at him. This man who'd been so arrogant and become so humble, who'd crossed oceans and cultures for her, who'd learned to see beyond wealth and power to the humanity connecting everyone. She thought about his mother's advice: maintain your ground, stay fully yourself, challenge him to be better. She thought about her own journey, from a trailer park in New Mexico to Columbia University to this rooftop, about speaking 5 languages and building bridges and refusing to be invisible. She thought about how this wasn't a fairy tale where the prince rescued the poor girl. This was 2 people choosing each other across difference, building something new together, creating their own story that honored both their pasts while moving toward a shared future. "Yes," she said, laughing through tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." Khalid stood, slipping the ring onto her finger, and kissed her as the sun set over New York City. Around them, the lights began to glow. Millions of lights, millions of stories, millions of people building bridges across their own divides. And somewhere in Dubai, Khalid's mother smiled when her son called to tell her the news, because she'd known from the beginning that the girl who spoke Arabic and wasn't afraid to challenge a billionaire was exactly who her son needed. 6 months later, they married in a ceremony that blended traditions, Arabic and American, religious and secular, intimate and grand. Heather wore a dress that was both white and embroidered with traditional Arabic patterns. Khalid wore a suit with a tie in the colors of the New Mexico sunset. They exchanged vows in 3 languages, English, Arabic and Spanish. Heather's mother sat beside Khalid's mother, 2 women from completely different worlds who'd both raised children to believe that education and kindness mattered more than money. After the wedding, Heather returned to her doctoral research, now fully funded by a grant from the Al Rahman Foundation, though she'd insisted on applying through the normal channels and being evaluated on merit. Khalid continued running his business empire, but with new priorities: fair treatment of workers, support for education initiatives, using his platform to challenge other wealthy individuals to see beyond their privilege. And every Tuesday evening, they had dinner at Meridian, where Carlos still joked about the night a billionaire learned to be human. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any joke. They'd both learned to be human together, to see beyond the surfaces of wealth and poverty, power and powerlessness, to the shared humanity underneath. They'd built a bridge between worlds and walked across it hand in hand. On their first anniversary, sitting in Heather's old studio apartment that they'd kept as a reminder of where they'd started, Khalid asked what she'd learned from their journey. Heather thought for a moment, then smiled. "I learned that sometimes the most arrogant people are just the most scared, that wealth doesn't protect you from grief or loneliness or the need to be seen, that bridges between worlds are built one conversation at a time, one moment of vulnerability, one choice to listen instead of judge." She took his hand. "And I learned that love isn't about being from the same world. It's about being willing to create a new one together." Khalid kissed her forehead, pulled her close, and they sat together in the tiny apartment that had once seemed like her whole world, knowing that their actual world now was so much bigger and so much better than either of them could have imagined that afternoon when an arrogant billionaire insulted a waitress in Arabic and she surprised them both by responding.